Welcome to Slight Reliability, the show where we learn SRE and observability 1 week at a time. I'm Stephen Townsend.
Welcome back to Slight Reliability. I'm Stephen Townsend, and this is the show where we learn about SRE and observability 1 week at a time. Today, I am here with Ankit Jain, who is the co-founder and CEO of Aviator. How are you going, Ankit?
Hey, Stephen. I'm really good. How are you? Thanks for having me here.
I'm good. I'm just settling into my new house and in my garage office, and I'm already realizing at wintertime it's going to be way too cold in here, so I don't know what I'm going to do, but we'll figure that out then. Tell me about Aviator. What's Aviator? What do you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So Aviator is a developer productivity platform. We help teams at large scale be able to improve their developer collaboration. So to think about it, right, a team of 10 engineers, probably like developer collaboration challenges are very different. But when you grow to like 100 or 1,000 engineering org, the challenges become much more complex. So those are the things which we help teams solve using automation. So a lot of things we look at is like things around like build failures, test failures, code review velocity. So focusing a lot around like how do we help teams be able to ship code faster. So from the time you write code to the time it gets into production, there's a lot of like friction that happens in large teams, and that's like what we try to solve with Aviator.
So today we were going to talk about this idea of developer experience, which is kind of a new topic, I think.
Yes.
And I thought I'd start by if I try and explain what I think developer experience is, and then you can tell me how wrong I am. How about
really?
that?
Let's do that.
Okay. So, I mean, I think it's pretty clear. Most people want to create a great experience for their end customers. That's the thing we do. We want it to be intuitive and easy to use and to make sense and to streamline the process and to direct them to where they need to go and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But up until fairly recently, I get the impression, and one of my previous guests, Sonia Shivwa, mentioned that from her perspective, if you're building software for other developers, the expectation used to be just build it, and then they need to read the manual. Read the manual, and then you figure it all out. Right? I don't know. And there's not a lot of thought into the experience of the developers as like they were customers.
Yes.
And I'm guessing the whole thing about a developer experience is it's about bringing the things that we do for our customers to other developers, treating them like customers. Is that kind of what it is?
To some degree, yes. I mean, if you think about it, back in the days, right, like there wasn't even systems like cloud systems like AWS or like Google Cloud, right? So essentially, you just had to, every engineer need to understand like the entire stack, need to understand like how things worked. Then we evolved SRE and DevOps, right? Because like now you can kind of like abstract out that certain engineers have speciality in understanding how to build systems, and there are other engineers who are doing like how to actually do product software, right? Now we are getting to the new generation where it's like, okay, there are still a lot more things that as a developer, you need to worry about when you think about like, doing code reviews, like thinking about your dev environments, thinking about like, how do you run CI/CD, right? Like there's a lot more, like another layer of abstraction that if you introduce that more, your developers become a lot more productive. So I think in some ways, that's how we think about like developer experience is like, what are the things that developers have to worry about that you can in some ways horizontally solve for them, so that they become more productive. At the same time, they're actually like focusing more on building and shipping faster rather than worrying about like, how do you run tests? Like, how do you actually like, merge code? How do you deploy? Like what kind of like, frequency of deployments are happening? So the entire developer life cycle, in some ways, we are also like always talk about like shift left movement, right? Like kind of like doing testing early. So all of those things kind of like become more complicated and more confusing, kind of like, there is like certain things that developers should not need to worry about. And I think that's like the next layer of abstraction that we are putting in so that like developers become more efficient. And I think that like is some of the core around developer experience.
So I've only heard the term developer experience for the last maybe 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Is it quite a recent thing?
It is relatively recent. I think there are like certain trends that happened probably more recently that caused a lot of focus on this. Part of it was like, if you think about, there weren't used to be that big engineering teams, right? Like if you think about today, it's not uncommon to have like an iOS team, which is like 100 engineers, right? Like there's at least like a handful of them, which are like just at the edge of nobody's ever seen teams that big collaborate together, right? So that's why like challenges have emerged today that weren't used to be there. I think the biggest trend that has actually happened is, as you know, COVID. So because of that, now we're working in a world where developers are just like asynchronously working, right? Like they're remotely located, different time zone. Like right now, you're in New Zealand and I'm here in Bay Area, and we're talking, right? So this essentially meant like you had to rethink a lot about uh, how you manage your workflows, how you typically work in day to day, right? For instance, documentation becomes more important because now you're going to work in different time zones. Code reviews become more complicated because now you're going to wait an entire day to get a feedback back on your like one line change, right? So all of those things have to be thought through again, and that's part of the reason also why developer experience become more critical.
I think another aspect of like the modern, like the current day, the modern era of software and technology, is that, as you were kind of alluding to, we put more expectation. There's more stuff to know. If you're a developer or an engineer, we're kind of saying, hey, developer, we also want you to be on call. And you also, to do that, you kind of also need to understand incident management and these monitoring tools and Kubernetes and the infrastructure. And it just becomes this overwhelming sort of array of things that you need to know about. And I suspect, I've heard through the conversations that I have, there is a sense of cognitive overload.
Yes.
Like, I can't know all of these things. And I'm guessing that developer experience can help alleviate that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, think about like there was a big movement around microservices. Now everyone is using microservices. The side effect of that is like now there are like hundreds of services that have to be deployed, right? Like everyone needs to know how these services interact with each other, right? Like that itself also creates a lot more complexities for these developers. And yes, like there's so many different technologies that everyone is using. There's like obviously log management that you're like kind of like doing error tracking. There's like, a bunch of tools you're using for like even understanding product feedback and quickly iterating. You're like running hundreds of experiments all the time. So yes, I mean, today's software world is so much more complicated than it used to be even like 10 years ago, right? So if you think about it, yes, like in some ways there's a lot more exciting things you can do, but at the same time, all of those come with additional cognitive effort for everyone, right? So it's in some ways like a double-edged sword.
So I most of my career, I've worked in the performance testing and engineering space. Now I'm sort of in the SRE world. So I mostly interact with, it was before like quality, sort of testing people and a mixture of people, but now it's more sort of the ops world.
Yes.
I'm not that keyed into like hardcore developers and what they do and what their challenges are. So I guess my question to you must talk to a lot of developers,
Yes.
right? So what kind of things frustrate developers at the moment?
Yes, I think like maybe first thing to you also like kind of like alluding to the point you're mentioning that there is also a DevOps and now there is like developer experience. Like I think maybe what's at least also worth digging into is like is there like a difference between a DevOps engineering and like a developer experience engineering team, or like are there like developer experience engineering teams even there? And then we can kind of like talk a little bit more about like specific problems too. Right. So we talk to a lot of like developers and a lot of companies we talk to. There isn't really like a function of like developer experience or developer productivity in many companies, right? Because as this is like a fairly new space, right? So most companies, when they think about developer experience or developer productivity, the baseline things you think about is like CI/CD, right? I think that's kind of like one thing which every developer has to interact with, and that's like one thing where like most common way a problem happens is like, oh, my build times are increasing, or our tests getting unstable, right? So, and that's where I think something happens in the companies where it's like, okay, now who is the person most knowledgeable about CI/CD, or like somebody who can really like help solve these challenges, right? So in some ways, most companies developer productivity or developer experience teams get evolved out of DevOps. So if you think about it, like it's an extension to a DevOps team, right? Again, like every company is defining them differently. So sometimes there'll be like a platform team. And then many companies will say platform team is just like internal developer platform. Some companies will say platform team includes infrastructure. So now it includes DevOps as well. Some companies just have like an infrastructure team where there's some people working on CI/CD, and then that's, becomes the developer experience team. So in some ways, it's defined very like differently. There isn't really like a standard that everyone follows. Although like platform engineering is sort of like now getting more commonly used to describe this. So from that, like now at least I can kind of like give you a little bit high level overview of how we think about developer experience, and I can tell you a little bit more about one thing I would love to also like discuss around is like developer experience versus developer productivity, because that's also like an interesting conversation we have a lot with a lot of our users. So the way we think about developer experience is it goes from day one for a developer joining a company. So essentially that it means is like, okay, what does a developer need on day one? Which is essentially like, knowledge, right? You kind of like need to understand how everything works in the system. So essentially like knowledge management, documentation, that is one of the first core aspects of your developer experience. Because one of the things you would want to measure is like how quickly does it take for a new member in your team to actually come and ship their first feature, right? So that's like the first part of it. And I think related to that, also for a new member in the team, is actually dev environments. Because as you probably know, there is a bunch of companies in the dev environments here. There's like GitHub code spaces, there's Gitpod, and there's like a few other that actually help like, run remote environments, because that becomes a lot easier for developers to actually like be able to execute code remotely and be able to like have ephemeral environments to run these things. And after that, kind of like, it goes into the next phase, which is how do you write your code? How do you kind of like, I think again, goes back into knowledge management, but like part of it is also how do you get your code reviewed, right? Because now once you write your code, now you kind of like need to share with your team members. And in large companies, right, like when you think about developer collaboration, this is like one place where a lot of teams feel that they lose a lot of time, because like, code reviews get slower, right? I mean, especially if it is a large organization, especially if you're doing like a horizontal refactor, we have seen like teams like, I used to work at Google, right? Even at Google, we had a very comprehensive structure around how code reviews are done. And like, there's like a lot of different configurations that we have. But at the same time, I remember my first code review took like 2 weeks to get that merged. And that actually is a real problem if you think about it, right? Like if you have over 1,000-person engineering team and you're kind of like making changes which actually like touches multiple components, now you need to go and like ask everyone, right? Like it almost becomes like like in politics we say canvassing, right? Like where you're actually trying to convince everyone is like, hey, can you actually like go look at my code and review it? So code review itself becomes an interesting problem. And after that, kind of like the main thing that goes into is like CI/CD, how you think about running your test, how big your code base is, like can you actually like, only run the required test as opposed to running the whole thing? How long does your CI/CD takes? Like we talk to a lot of companies, it goes from anywhere from like a few seconds to like, 3 hours, 4 hours. So it's all over the place. So like there isn't really like a gold standard, but we talk a lot about like, how long does it take to actually like make your code mergeable? And then again, it goes about like build failures. And then last but not the least is actually deployments. And this is where kind of like deployments is where there's a huge overlap with the DevOps and reliability as well. So it's like a whole spectrum of things. And again, like even after deployment, there's actually monitoring and kind of like bug tracking. Those things also in some ways come around like developer experience, because developers themselves have to track all the issues that are coming in their code base, coming from code changes.
When I hear you talk about, starting from day one, you start your job for the first time and streamlining that process so that you are able to do things and be productive, right? I guess I can already see there's two sides to it, right? There's the experience of each person. Like I'm a developer. I need a sense of agency, and so I can get on and be useful and feel connected and know what to do and where to go. And there's that. And then there's the other side of it is organizations wanting their developers to be productive. Is that the difference between developer productivity versus developer experience? Or is it something else?
I mean, that is actually the difference, right? So we talk a lot about this, and this is also a very, very debated topic. So there is developer experience and developer productivity, at least from my perspective, is two sides of the same coin, right? At the end of the day, what everyone is trying to achieve is business outcomes. But for business outcomes, what leadership is looking at is like, okay, how fast can we ship features? How fast can we ship code, right? And that's where kind of the productivity comes in, right? Because in some ways they're trying to identify is like, okay, what are the bottlenecks? How do we even measure? How do we even like compare? Like, okay, I'm company A, or what? Like if you compare with like another company, my competitors, how are we shipping code faster, right? Because like time to market is very important in the business world. So kind of like coming from there, developer productivity becomes more important. And I think in some ways there's a lot of insecurities also, because it's like there isn't a very good understanding, especially if you're like at very top leadership, around like, how fast we are shipping the code. So this is where productivity becomes interesting. And then there's again a lot of like recent research that has been done around productivity. There's like actually a few standards that have been introduced. There is something called DORA metrics, which was created by an independent research, DevOps research and assessment, which actually now eventually became part of Google. So now Google publishes a DevOps report every year, kind of like talking about that. And more recently, some of the same folks actually also created something called a space framework, which is also kind of like in a related space, like way, but like they focus a little bit more on developer experience. They focus more on like, okay, how do we actually like, really understand, are developers really happy, right? I think there is a lot of debate around like, should we even measure productivity? Should our focus only be that? Can we actually get developers more working in the flow state? Because if they're working in the flow state, they're really happy, they're satisfied. One, you'll have lesser churn. So like, like your developers are actually like sticking around in the company, they're actually gaining knowledge as well as like really motivated to do work. And at the same time, if they're more and more in the flow, they're actually able to like produce features, they're able to like do work more efficiently, right? So, so there is that aspect around like developer satisfaction, developer experience, and a lot of new things around that space have been focused around like, can we actually like get more feedback from developers themselves? So focus a little bit more on qualitative feedback as well, not just quantitative, which we are calculating from like things like DORA metrics. So I think in some ways, the way I perceive this is you need to create a balance of both, right? Leadership still needs to understand how fast we are shipping features, how fast we are hitting time to market. But at the same time, the foundation still lies in actually focusing on developer experience. How do we actually like remove all the friction from developers' workflows day to day so that they actually perform better?
Measuring developer productivity, it's a minefield in itself, even for a technology first company like Google. In fact, I was talking to someone from Google actually about a month or so ago, and we were talking about the difference between Google is sort of engineering first. So empowering developers is key, right? If you can get them in that flow state, good things happen because they're solving engineering problems. Yes. I've worked in other contexts. So what about like an insurance company, for example? And it's not just about getting developers up to, in flow. What's almost more important for overall productivity is that the things that they are doing are contributing effectively to the vision of the product and the plan for the business, yes. Right? And there's often a disconnect between these things because engineers want to do cool stuff.
Yes.
They want to do cool stuff and solve technical problems. Sometimes it's the easy thing or the not so fun thing, which is going to do the most benefit to the business. And that's another thing. So that's why I think that trying to measure developer productivity is so hard in a complex non-technology like enterprise, because it's not necessarily about, you can measure the productivity as much as you want,
right? But
it doesn't tell you whether you're building a great product and service for the customer,
right? Right.
And I don't know. What do you think of that?
I think that's actually a very good point, and it's honestly very hard to measure. Essentially, what you're saying is like, how do we even measure the outcomes, right? Because developers can be working on a lot of things. And like, generally as developers, right, like we consider ourselves, like I'll still consider myself a developer. So we consider ourselves as creative people, right? So as creative people, we want to do creative things. And the reality is a lot of business outcomes are driven by doing not so creative things, right? So that essentially means is like, as a developer who's like really motivated about a vision of the company, you still are working on things that may not be as exciting. They may not be cutting edge, right? And that's like a balance that always teams and companies have to build with the developers, where it's like, okay, we are actually like still building some of the cutting edge technology, but at the same time, the end result, we are focused on the outcomes of the business. And this is kind of like, I think, where engineering has to get like tie really well with like product management or PM function if there is one in the company, and like as well as the leadership, right? So prioritization, again, like it goes to like that problem, which I think is a little bit parallel, but like not directly related to productivity.
I think you would, my colleague Tim Wheeler would love to talk to you because part of his job, he's a director of developer productivity, I think is the word, but he's looking at developer experience too and trying to figure out what do we measure and how do we measure it in an effective way. And So I guess I'm curious. So how you've touched on it a bit. You talk about qualitative. Is that like literally conversations, surveys? Like, well, how do you get that feedback about developer experience?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then how do you translate that into a way which, say, leadership can interpret and make decisions based off?
Yes, actually, there's like two different aspects of it, right? Like one is like how do you even like get a pulse of all the information, and I think the second part is actually like how do you convince leadership that we need to invest into this, right? So I'll start with the first part, and this is something which is like a very so we also run a developer experience community. We talk to a lot of like companies there as well, and this is like a very common topic that comes up there, which is like how do you even understand what developers want? And like what are some of the frustrations that's blocking people? So some of the great ideas that have come up recently in those conversations is one is if you don't have any resources, if you don't have anything at all, the simplest thing you can do is like if you use like Slack or Microsoft Teams or any kind of like communication channel, just create like a channel for developers to like rant about issues that they're experiencing on day-to-day basis. Becomes a gold mine for people, right? Because like now you really understand what really frustrates developer on day to day, right? And it doesn't even take a lot of effort for developers to just kind of like rant it out, right? And as you know, like many developers really enjoy doing ranting about like these issues. So that's one thing which we actually recommend if you are just getting started with your developer experience journey in a company. Like just create a channel, let people openly like share their pain points and their gripes. And then I think like once you have a framework, once you have a structure, once you have enough time and resources, the most valuable thing that people can do when we think more about like qualitative data is actually running surveys. So there are like few companies who actually help you run surveys, but like it's otherwise as simple as setting up like a Google form and sharing it with the developers, right? I think there is so much we can learn, and like a lot of modern companies who have very established developer experience teams are actually like still running surveys. Typically, you can run surveys. Ideally, you can run it every quarter, but that can also get like a little bit overwhelming for people. Like typically, you'd want to run it like every 6 months or so, but you would want to also continue asking the same questions, because I think that ties into the second aspect, which is impact. Because if you're thinking about developer experience, if you're thinking about improving developer experience, you'd want to see, are things improving? Are there trends? Like, are there like, I don't know, like what people were talking about build times being slow, and we worked on improving build times. Like, are they getting better? Right? Are there like still flaky tests in the system? Like, are those things getting removed? So those are some of the things that you can actually measure now, both qualitatively as well as quantitatively, if you do those surveys. So more structurally, I think that's what we recommend teams do, is like start very simple, just kind of like in an open channel to get started, like have people talk about it, and then form a more formal structure once you have the resources to actually like work on it in a systematic way. And I think those survey results become one of the core things where you can actually share with the leadership. Now, all of these things still go in parallel with like things like Dura metrics that we talked about earlier, right? Dura metrics are, for the most part, something that you can actually generate from the system, right? So these are entirely quantitative metrics, and you can like really like connect. There are like few services out there. We also help teams with like calculating Dura metrics, but like at the end of the day, you just want to understand is like how frequently you're deploying code, like how often, like how long does it take from somebody writing code to getting that into production, and how are there like failures in the system? Like how long does it take to resolve those failures? So there are like 4-5 specific metrics that in Dura that you calculate. Space Framework is a little bit more complicated because again, it focuses more on like, some qualitative stuff as well, which I think surveys do a good job of. So it's kind of like, two sides of the same coin. You cannot ignore one, but at the same time, if you just look at Dura metrics, it's going to be really hard to move that needle without getting input from the users, right? I think teams that have really succeeded at developer experience, they actually consider like kind of like where you started, Stephen, this conversation in the morning with, is where at the end of the day, a developer experience team is still a product team, right? Like some companies even have product managers for this. So it's still a product team, which is focused on customers who are the internal developers in the company, right? So if you think about like, if you put like that lens on, you actually can make significant improvement and like be more methodical about the process.
Obviously, the best thing to do is to listen to your developers about what they're going through and to help them effectively, and and within their specific context. But kind of conceptually, at a high level, what are some like conceptual things that you can do to sort of improve the lives of developers, to reduce their cognitive load and their enjoyment of their work? Like, what are some maybe some core things you can focus on? I mean, you've covered some things. I mean, you've talked about like improving CI/CD
Yes.
and sort of streamlining that. That's one thing. Yeah. You talked about access to documentation and making that easy.
Correct.
I guess the quality of the documentation too. What other things?
Yeah, I mean, like even at Aviator, for instance, we help teams like avoid build failures, because there is a huge impact of build failures on people's productivity, right? Like if you think about your main line, if your main line ever fails, it has a cascading snowball effect, because now everyone who's like building on through main, or like kind of like picking those changes and like trying to make their own changes on top of that, all of those builds are now going to fail, right? This is going to create a huge friction for the teams as well. And now your deployments get slower, right? Like now, if you have a hotfix you want to deploy, there isn't really a way because your builds are broken, right? So this is a very common place that we've noticed more recently, where as your teams grow, especially if you're working on shared repositories, like builds will fail multiple times a day, and like this creates a huge toil on developer workflows. So that's like one thing that developers can focus on. There are like different workflows now you can actually do. Like there is something called merge queue that we also support like at an enterprise scale, where you can actually like combine different changes, essentially run all the builds right before you actually like merge to mainline, as opposed to kind of doing it after it's merged. The other thing is around testing. So very commonly, flaky test becomes a problem these days, especially as like your systems get more and more complex. You're running end-to-end tests. Network issues happen, right? Like state issues happen. Tests can be written poorly. Infrastructure issues can happen. There are many reasons why your test can become unstable. And that's also the reason, right? Like now developers are writing one-line change, I don't know, modifying a README file, right? For whatever reason, if the test run for that, now you're actually like looking at, okay, why is modifying a README file actually making my test break, right? So that itself creates so much cognitive load, because now people need to do context switching to figure out like, okay, what really happened, have to debug, and then slow down their workflows, right? So these are like small nuggets of places where if you think about like one off, it doesn't really make a big difference. But you think about at scale, right? Like if every developer has to worry about one flaky test every day, right? We're talking about like 100 developers like spending 15 minutes to an hour, like really trying to figure out like what really happened.
That used to drive me up the wall in the past, where you'd have these deployments going off and you'd have all these tests, and some tests would always fail and got to the point where people would like, just ignore them, or we'll put them like optional, or just throw a warning. And it's like, well, what's the point of the test then? Like, come on, if we're going to make these tests reliable enough so that the automation takes care of things, otherwise, what's the point of the automation?
Exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, it's more about like building the trust with the developers, right? Because if your tests are not stable, like developers would not trust even their own code. Like, is it going to break anything in the system, right? Because like if your tests are broken half the time, now you don't know whether it's broken because of my change, or is it broken because like, they're just unstable. So having unstable tests is actually like one of the key areas where, where developer experience really goes downhill very fast. Right. And again, it goes back to like how much trust does the developer have in the overall platform and the system.
I only have one more question, and that is that let's say there's an engineering manager out there, or maybe a staff engineer, and they can see that their developers in the team or the wider organization are really struggling. They would like to improve developer experience across their team or their org. How can they get started?
I mean, it goes back to the same thing that I suggested before, right? Like the simplest way to get started is, as I said, like just throw a Slack channel out there. Like actually have a channel that's focused predominantly on complaints. And you'll be surprised, like people talk about like doing these anonymously, but no, like developers don't care about like being anonymous, especially when they have to like, complain about how bad the systems they are in. I think that is one place where you can make a big difference. You can really understand like what the big pain points are. Because at the end of the day, if you just go at metrics, you start to kind of like try to solve those, and you keep developers out of that conversation, you end up like building a workflow or a system that developers don't need or don't care about, or doesn't really like solve that frustration. So I think it's very important to actually like start with understanding those pain points, and like again, like qualitative and quantitative data around that is very important. So I would recommend everyone like who's thinking about developer experience, thinking about how do we actually get started on that. Best way to start is actually like create an open place for people to like rant out, talk about like all the complaints. One thing actually like which was also came up in a recent conversation I was having with some other developers is developer experience team is also something which always is like fighting an uphill battle, right? Like in some ways you can improve developer experience, but like very rarely people say like, oh, the world is perfect, right? So there's always going to be things that you have to improve. One thing to always do well as a developer experience team and as a kind of like just overall health of this team is to also celebrate the wins. Like you kind of like, if you measure like, okay, your build times went from like 60 minutes now to 20 minutes. That's a huge improvement, right? Like at 20 minutes is still not perfect, but like you should actually celebrate that. Yes, like we actually made a lot of improvements to make that happen. So those are at least like a couple of things I would recommend anyone who's thinking about this space or just getting started.
Well, Ankit, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about developer experience, which is something I'm guessing many of my listeners, and myself included, don't know much about, and I think it's important. And I think there's going to be a growing trend towards sort of developer experience where the developers are reliability engineers, SREs,
Yes.
as well. It's all kind of coming together. So, and also as SREs, especially if you're working in a sort of more platform engineering space where you're building self-service to help developers, deploy and operate their services better, then keeping developer experience in mind is part of that job, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And honestly, like one of the best things about being a developer experience team is you're making an impact across your engineering organization, right? Like especially if you're like thousands of engineers, that's a great way to actually show impact, right? Like otherwise, if you're working on a particular product feature, you're working in one particular team. But like when you actually work in developer experience, you actually like touch lives of every developer who's working in a company.
Cool. So that's all from another episode of Site Reliability. And to everyone, I hope you have a wonderful week, and I'll see you all next time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephen. This was really fun. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your day.